many candidates have focused clearly on the calculations in their studies and are generally quite well prepared for those. But what they aren't prepared for anywhere near as well is the discussion type points, particularly in section C. Explanation of terms and concepts, pros and cons and evaluation, those kinds of things. And I can imagine why this happens, that quite often when we're studying at home and we've got numbers to do, that's something you can get your teeth into, and you can check it back to the model answers, mark it yourself, those kinds of things. And it's tempting to say, oh well, the words, I'll just make those up on the day, and tend to neglect those. But I reckon nearly up to half the marks in this exam are going for non-numerical aspects. So it's dangerous to leave those wordy parts, those narrative parts, and just say, oh well, I'll just make something up on the day, because quite often they test your understanding of the numbers and what's behind the numbers and the pros and cons of the calculations and so on. So make sure when you're studying in your own time you are practicing the more narrative style multiple choice questions, but also make sure you're practicing the section C questions in full, and that includes the narrative sections in there. Force yourself to write the answer out in full to give yourself some practice with exam technique. Because an awful lot of the examiner's criticisms at the end of the day come down to poor exam technique. The examiner emphasises in his report on section A that it would help if candidates practiced as many objective test questions as possible before the day. So any learning materials you've got, make sure you make the most of those in preparation for the exam. In section B, the examiner is at pains to point out that you need to follow the instructions carefully on how to answer the question. So for example, if a question asks you to select 2 correct statements, then you can only get awarded marks if 2 and only 2 have been selected. You don't get partial marking, so if you only select 1, you'll never get half marks. So make sure you read the questions particularly carefully to make sure that you get the mark going in the OT questions in section B. In addition, if there's number entry questions, make sure the format is right. So the question will give you a format, maybe rounding to the nearest 1,000 or something like that. Make sure you follow that, otherwise again you'll get no marks at all. What a waste. 1 or 2 particular concerns in section B I wanted to draw out. First of all, when it comes to investment appraisal, lots of people do really well in the NPV calculations, but there are some common mistakes, and one relates to the timing of project cash flows. So be absolutely clear in your own mind when cash flows occur, and this involves reading the question carefully. For example, if it's in advance, it's at the start of a year. If it's in arrears, it's at the end of that year. And just be aware that people often get their years wrong when it comes to NPV, so pay particular attention to that. A small point here, but this point's been made so many times in past examiners' reports that I thought it was worth mentioning specifically here, that when you're calculating a price-earnings ratio, a PE ratio, the earnings figure that goes into that ratio is the earnings that are relevant to the ordinary shareholders. So that is after tax, so profit after tax, but also after preference dividends. Preference shareholders have to be paid before ordinary shareholders can get hold of any earnings at all. So a PE ratio is based on profit after tax and after preference dividends as well. Just bear that one in mind. Like I say, it's only a minor point, but it's been raised so many times it's worth mentioning. People also tend to underestimate and sideline when it comes to the risk management part of the syllabus. They tend to sideline the interest rate derivatives bit. Pay particular attention to that. Again, this has been brought up on more than one examiner's report now. So that's interest rate futures in particular. Make sure you're happy with the basics of how they work. It's not examinable to a massively complex level. There isn't loads of numbers or anything like that. But I think a lot of people tend to just overlook that entirely. So make sure that you're focusing on that. Then lastly, for section C, this is where the examiner again criticises candidates for their work in relation to discussion type questions. He says that the calculations are generally pretty good, but the discussion answers are particularly poor. And that's because in section C you're required to have a deeper understanding of the topics, because there's more scope in a longer question to really challenge you and find out how much you do actually know and how much you understand. Quite often the examiner says there could be up to 10 marks going for a discursive question, and candidates often simply don't even attempt that, as if that's a strategy that I'll just do the numbers and forget the words. Well, like I said earlier on, round about half the exam is words. So it's a very, very dangerous technique. And all I would say is, once again, make sure that when you're studying in the run-up to the exam, you practice those discursive questions and practice writing the answers out in full. Make sure that when you're writing your answer out, actually, the structure of your answer reflects the structure of the question. So if there's 3 or 4 key words in the question, make sure you've got those 3 or 4 key words as headings in your answer. And that helps you to answer the question set. It also makes your answer easier to mark, gives you the focus that you need. The examiner says, possibly slightly sarcastically at times, but candidates often answer the question they wish they'd been asked, or they prefer they'd been asked, rather than the actual question. So make sure that the question you're writing an answer to is actually the one you've been asked, and not one that suits what you know better. When it comes to commenting on calculations, more than just 1 or 2 words is required, and this is, again, has been mentioned before, that when you do an NPV calculation, for example, and it comes out with positive, I know the standard approach for a lot of people is just to say, therefore accept. And the examiner says, well, that's not really a full comment. You need to say why you should accept. So, as to do so will maximise shareholder wealth, or something like that, demonstrating a bit of understanding as to the reasoning behind that. As well as making sure you're reading the question carefully, also make sure you're using the scenario information properly. As the examiner says, he's surprised how often, when he says, for example, in a question, the tax liability is settled in the year in which it arises, in an investment appraisal question, he's surprised at how often people will then delay paying the tax liability by 1 year. So make sure you're reading the scenario information to get absolute clarity on how these things need to be treated. Coming back again to the point about making sure you actually answer the question set, examiner also mentioned in his report that there's a tendency for people to avoid actually directly answering the requirement and just adopting a write all you know about the 1 or 2 keywords in the question you understand. And they generally score very, very poorly because you aren't actually answering the question set there. So make sure your answer is very much attuned to what the question is asking. Now, just to finish off on spreadsheet and word processing technique, because increasingly this exam is computer based. The examiner says that candidates are getting better at making sure their computer based assessment answers are better labelled so that the markers can follow what's going on, and to keep that up really. So for example, if you've got 0.12 in one cell, don't expect the examiner, the marker, to know that that's a 12% cost of equity in that cell. You need to label that cell next to it just to say what's actually in there. Also, if you use formulas, then you can get method marks for the formulas, even if there's slight errors in it. But if you just type in a number, that's the equivalent to just putting a number in a written answer with no workings. So if that number's wrong, you'll get 0 for it. So try and use the formula-based approach wherever possible. And the last point on word processing, the examiner says that in a professional work environment, just because you're using a word processor doesn't mean that you can ignore the words that you use in terms of how professional they are and how well spelt they are, punctuated and grammar and all those kinds of things are not unimportant at this level. Now, I know what he means. It's worthwhile making sure your answer is legible and sounds good. You get credit for that. But just don't worry if English isn't your first language. The marking team are aware of that as an issue and a concern of people, and allowances will be made for that. It's more to do with things like getting the tone right in your responses, and having it good enough so that people can actually understand what's going on. So in short, guys, for F9, lots and lots of question practice is needed, and don't ignore those discursive bits. Make sure you're having a go at those section C discursive elements on a regular basis, and that will actually help with other parts of the paper because it helps thoroughly test your understanding. Best of luck and thanks for listening.